everyone, welcome to another recent reads video. I read a lot of books in December of 2016 because I had to meet my Goodreads challenge, so let's just jump right in. So the first book that I read in December was Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. So I went into this knowing basically what everyone knows, that it's about a paedophile named Humbert and his relationship with Dolores Hayes, who he nicknames Lolita. I did not expect it to be this good, and I did not expect a lot of the stuff that happens in this book. It just surpassed my expectations completely. As everyone says, the writing is incredible. It is so beautiful to read. It is like reading poetry, but it's a 300-page novel. The thing that I loved about this book was the perspective. It's from Humbert's perspective, but it's not just an unreliable narrator. He also kind of changes perspective. He goes into the third person and refers to himself as a different man. He uses all these little stylistic features and parts of his writing that make this novel so interesting to read. I kind of wanted to see how things played out. This book is such an experience. It gives you incredible writing, interesting plot, characters, like everything's going on in this book. So if you don't think a book like this will be particularly triggering for you, then I would highly recommend picking it up. It's kind of something that I think people should go on their own journey with, because everyone will have a different experience with this book. The next book I read was A Happy Death by Albert Camus. So I picked this up because my favourite book is The Outsider by Camus, and this is kind of like the precursor to The Outsider. The main character's name is Merceau, but it's from third person instead of first person. A few different plot points happen in this book compared to The Outsider. It's not the same plot, but there are a lot of like little things that you can sort of relate to The Outsider, little events or characters. So A Happy Death is the story of Patrice Merceau and his life in Algeria and his desire to get a happy death. He isn't really aspiring to a happy life so much as like dying in peace and resolved to death. A really, really interesting concept, and that's essentially the reason that you would read this book. The plot itself isn't that interesting. The plot sort of just happens. It's sort of just the way in which Camus communicates his beliefs and ideas. It's not so much the actual central piece of the novel, and it's not particularly good. Like, he just sort of goes to Prague and then sort of comes back. It's a bit weird. I don't think this was an excellent book in terms of actual plot or characters, but the philosophy, which is what it's sort of all about with Camus, is really interesting. It very much rings true to me. It's not quite as extreme and existentialist as The Outsider. It's a lot more personal. It's more about Camus' actual feelings. And there are so many interesting quotes and so many interesting perspectives on death. I very much think it's worth the read, but it's not as much of like a, I guess, literature masterpiece as I would say The Outsider is. The structure's not particularly good. The language isn't as strong as The Outsider, but it is, as a standalone book, quite interesting, and I would recommend it if you're interested in like perspectives on death and the philosophy that Camus had. The next book I read is a collection of short stories by Ivan Turgenev. It's called First Love and Other Stories. I have mixed feelings about this collection. I really liked Fathers and Sons, which is like Turgenev's most popular short novel, but this didn't quite hit the mark every time. Turgenev does love and romance and all that really, really well. It's really always very cute and passionate, and he always relates it back to nature, and I really, really like the themes that he hits upon in this book. But some of the stories were really slow or repetitive and kind of didn't have the ending that you want in a short story. When I read a short story, I want a bang last line on the ending, like a poem. These didn't necessarily give particularly good ending. My favourite stories in this collection were First Love, The Song of Triumphant Love, and The Diary of a Superfluous Man. King Lear of the Steppes is the longest one in this collection, and it definitely takes time to build. It's kind of like a novel. It's not as quick in terms of exposition as you'd expect from a short story. It's a lot more novel-like in its writing style and kind of approach to telling a story. But it stayed with me. Like, the actual themes touched upon in King Lear of the Steppes and the story is quite harrowing and moving. I found that even though I wasn't quite sure why it was 70 pages long, I did enjoy what it kind of had to say. I just wish that it had been written differently, or as an entire novel, not in this weird half short story, half novella, not quite either sort of format. The titular story, First Love, was really fun and emotional. It has that sort of banging last line. I really, really enjoyed that story. Some of the other stories touch on really interesting ideas like serfdom. Other ones also touch on First Love, but I think they were kind of not as good standalone. I think in a collection they were interesting, but they weren't something I'd be like, you have to read. And then the last story, which isn't really mentioned anywhere, it's not on the back, it's barely in the introduction, but it's The Song of Triumphant Love, and that was such a good short story. It's very different from the rest. It's set in Italy, it's very magical and ambiguous, but it was such a good end to the story collection. Like, I finished the short story collection on a high, so I really did enjoy that last story. I think it was some really interesting work that Turgenev did, and very different from a lot of his other stories. In general, he doesn't really do stuff like that. Overall, I would recommend reading this if you like Turgenev and you want to see him do what he does best, plus some other interesting approaches that he doesn't usually do. The second last book I read of the year, and the one that I read during Christmas time, was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë, and oh boy was this good. This is, I think, my only 5-star read for the year. I loved this book. It is worth the hype. I didn't really enjoy the first 200 pages of Jane Eyre because I didn't go into this book with the correct expectations. I thought it would be something that it wasn't, and I was looking for something that it wasn't going to be, or isn't its best part. I went into it knowing that it was compared to Wuthering Heights a lot. I love Wuthering Heights, but Wuthering Heights is very, very different to Jane Eyre. It's a very different story. Wuthering Heights is very much a passionate love story. Jane Eyre is the biography of Jane Eyre. It's not a love story. It has love story elements, but that's not the core of this novel and not the reason that I would recommend it to people. So if you're going into this novel thinking about Wuthering Heights, put that aside. It's very much the story of Jane Eyre from being a young child to being a woman. In a way, a coming-of-age novel, but it's so good. I took some notes while I read this book because I knew that I wanted to talk about it. I didn't want to just rave at you like I just did for a minute. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of why I love Jane Eyre. First of all, the perspective is really cool. It's from the first person. That is not very gothic. If you know anything about gothic literature, you know about that frame narrative and the way that it's often told from someone who wasn't there. Jane Eyre is told from first person perspective. She tells her story, which is just so cool. Another thing I love about perspective is occasionally it will sort of go into second person. She'll be talking to a character and then their speech will kind of be commenting on what Jane is doing. So it's like second person, and I really, really liked that because you saw Jane from an outside perspective where usually you're from her inside, you're getting her point of view, her beliefs, but then occasionally it will just go from someone else's and you can see Jane from the outside, and that's really, really important in first person, and I really loved the way it was done. It's done very well. In general, I just loved the character of Jane. She is such a cool character, and I really liked the way that Charlotte Brontë wrote Jane. Often, she'll stop and go into like short sentences and call on her inner strength. Like, she'll just stop and go, I can do this. I am strong. I believe in myself. And it's so good as like a fellow young woman to be reading this kind of literature. It's just very cool to see in the 19th century. Charlotte Brontë was way ahead of her time. There is so much like feminist stuff going on, like explicit feminist discourse in this book. It's great. I love it. I also liked the theme of grief and hard decisions. It was really something that means a lot to me, and I think the way that Charlotte wrote about Jane and how she dealt with life and her situation is just really good to read. I very much felt that I needed to read this book, and it changed me. It really did. It changed my perspective. It changed how I think about myself and how I want to be. It really is a book that sort of didn't just touch me in like an emotional way. It made me want to be a different person and kind of go out and make changes. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre changed me. So I would highly recommend reading this book if you're expecting a Wuthering Heights gothic sort of thing. Don't get me wrong, there are gothic elements, there is a love element, but what you're getting when you pick up this book is the fictional biography of a young girl, and it's incredible. So if this is something that you think you can get something out of, please read it. It's worth it. The writing is beautiful, the characters are beautiful, the story's beautiful. Okay, that's Jane Eyre. That's all I'll say. I love it. The last book of the year was, I think, my lowest rated book. It's Dark Roots by Kate Kennedy. So I picked up this book because it's a short story collection. It's contemporary Australian literature, so it's really, really easy and quick to read. And I ended up giving this 2 stars. I didn't really like it. The main problem I had with it is a lot of the stories are written in second person, which is good for like one-off stories, but over and over again, ambiguous second person stories all about finding out who they are, what their situation is, and why they're in that situation. If you like second person, then maybe you will like this, but I didn't. My favourite stories in this were The Light of Coincidence and Wheelbarrow Thief and Resize. Those last two are written in the third person and the first one is written in first person. I just didn't like the second person. However, I did like those three stories and I'm very glad I read this because those three stories I think will stick with me. Another problem I had with this story collection is all the plot and drama hinges on inherently dramatic themes. Just wanted a story that was interesting with interesting characters that didn't need something very dramatic to sort of pin the whole story on. And I don't think it's very good story writing that your entire story hinges on like murder or assault and that's it. And that's supposed to be the big punchline. If you like ambiguous starts and your whole thing is like finding out who they are and what their life is, then yeah, go for this. But personally, it's not the kind of short stories that I'm into. And I find that when it's all like back to back in a collection like that, it just isn't very good. Something I did like about reading this though is because it's contemporary Australian and the author is from Melbourne, there were so many like little references to Australian contemporary culture, like kind of Australian culture, Melbourne culture, which I found really fun because I read a lot of classics and I essentially read no books set from where I live. So reading this was really fun when they mentioned like a street name that I recognize or like calling bags crumplers. That was really cute. This made me want to read more books set in Australia and particularly set in Melbourne. So yeah, overall it was disappointing, but I wouldn't not read more Kate Kennedy because the stories she did do in third person or first person were quite interesting. And she has a sort of style that I could like in third person, but it's just way too ambiguous most of the time. So those were all the books that I read in December of 2016. I hope you enjoyed. I had a really good reading month in December because I didn't have school, so I could just sit and read. Thank you for watching this video. If you've read any of these books, or if you've read Jane Eyre and you love it as much as I do, please comment below. And yeah, I will see you later. Bye!